In the autumn of 1928, a Scottish bacteriologist named Alexander Fleming returned to his laboratory at St. Mary's Hospital in London after a brief summer holiday, completely unaware that he was about to stumble upon one of the most significant discoveries in medical history. The laboratory, located in the Praed Street wing of the hospital, was cluttered with petri dishes containing bacterial cultures that Fleming had been studying before his departure. What he found upon his return would eventually save millions of lives during the most devastating conflict humanity had ever witnessed. Fleming's research focused primarily on Staphylococcus bacteria, common microorganisms responsible for numerous infections that plagued hospitals and medical facilities throughout the early 20th century. His workspace reflected the methodical yet somewhat disorganized nature of his scientific approach. Dishes stacked upon dishes, some cleaned and prepared for new experiments, others left to observe bacterial growth patterns over extended periods. On this particular September morning, as Fleming sorted through his accumulated work, one dish caught his attention in a way that would alter the course of medical science forever. The petri dish in question had become contaminated with a peculiar mold during Fleming's absence, a common enough occurrence in laboratories of that era where sterilization techniques were not yet perfected to modern standards. However, what made this contamination extraordinary was not the presence of the mold itself, but rather what was happening around it. Fleming observed with growing fascination that the bacterial colonies surrounding the mold had been destroyed, creating a clear zone where no bacteria could grow. The Staphylococcus cultures that should have flourished across the entire surface of the growth medium had been systematically eliminated in the immediate vicinity of this uninvited fungal guest. Fleming's trained eye immediately recognized the potential significance of this phenomenon. The mold, which he would later identify as belonging to the Penicillium genus, specifically Penicillium notatum, was producing some substance that possessed powerful antibacterial properties. This was not merely preventing bacterial growth, it was actively destroying established bacterial colonies, something that existing antiseptics could accomplish outside the human body but rarely within living tissue, without causing harm to the patient as well. The implications were staggering, though Fleming could not yet comprehend the full magnitude of what lay before him on that laboratory bench. Over the following weeks and months, Fleming conducted numerous experiments to isolate and understand this antibacterial substance, which he named penicillin after the mold that produced it. He grew the penicillium mold in liquid culture, discovering that the broth in which the mold grew contained the active antibacterial agent. Fleming found that even when diluted up to 800 times, this mold juice, as he informally called it, could still inhibit the growth of many common disease-causing bacteria. He tested it against various bacterial species, documenting which were susceptible to its effects and which remained resistant. Fleming's initial research revealed that penicillin was remarkably selective in its action, affecting certain types of bacteria while leaving others unharmed. This selectivity would later prove crucial in medical applications, as it meant the substance could target specific infections without destroying all bacteria indiscriminately. He also made another critical observation. Penicillin appeared to be non-toxic to human tissue. In preliminary tests, he found that it did not harm white blood cells, the body's natural defenders against infection, which was a characteristic that set it apart from many antiseptics of the time that were as harmful to human cells as they were to bacteria. Despite the promising nature of his findings, Fleming encountered significant obstacles in advancing his discovery toward practical medical application. The penicillin he was able to produce was unstable and difficult to isolate in pure form. The substance degraded quickly, losing its antibacterial properties within days or even hours. Fleming lacked the chemical expertise and resources necessary to purify and concentrate penicillin into a form that could be administered as a medicine. The technology and biochemical knowledge required to overcome these challenges was simply beyond the capabilities of his small laboratory at St. Mary's Hospital. Fleming published his findings in the British Journal of Experimental Pathology in 1929, describing both the antibacterial properties of penicillin and his unsuccessful attempts to use it clinically. The paper, while scientifically sound, failed to generate significant interest in the medical community. Researchers read his work with mild curiosity, but did not pursue its therapeutic potential with any urgency. The general consensus was that penicillin might be useful as a laboratory tool for isolating certain types of bacteria, but few saw it as a viable treatment option for human infections. Fleming himself continued his other research while maintaining cultures of the Penicillium mold, hoping that someone with the necessary expertise might eventually take up the challenge he could not overcome alone. Throughout the 1930s, Fleming's discovery remained largely dormant, a scientific curiosity mentioned occasionally in academic circles, but never developed into practical application. The world continued to struggle with bacterial infections that claimed countless lives. Pneumonia, septicemia, meningitis, and wound infections remained leading causes of mortality, particularly in hospitals where post-operative infections were common, despite the best efforts of surgeons and medical staff. The medical community relied heavily on antiseptics for external use and a limited number of sulfonamide drugs that had been introduced in the mid-1930s, but these options were far from adequate in addressing the full spectrum of bacterial diseases. As the 1930s drew to a close, international tensions escalated across Europe and Asia. The shadow of another world conflict loomed ever larger, and military planners began to consider the medical challenges that would accompany modern warfare. The experiences of the First World War remained fresh in military medical consciousness. The horrific wound infections, the cases of gangrene that necessitated amputations, the septicemia that claimed soldiers' lives days or weeks after they had survived the initial trauma of their injuries. Medical officers understood that in the coming conflict, the ability to treat infections effectively could be as crucial to military success as any tactical or strategic advantage on the battlefield. In Oxford, England, a team of researchers led by Australian-born pathologist Howard Walter Florey was investigating various biological substances with potential medical applications. Florey, who had become professor of pathology at Oxford University in 1935, assembled a talented group of scientists from diverse backgrounds. Among them was Ernst Boris Chain, a German Jewish biochemist who had fled Nazi Germany in 1933. Chain possessed the chemical expertise that Fleming had lacked, and his skills would prove essential in transforming penicillin from a laboratory curiosity into a medical miracle. In 1938, Chain came across Fleming's 9-year-old paper while reviewing scientific literature on antibacterial substances. Intrigued by the potential implications, he brought it to Florey's attention. The Oxford team decided to include penicillin among several naturally occurring antibacterial agents they planned to investigate systematically. Their research program aimed to isolate, purify, and test these substances to determine whether any possessed therapeutic value. Unlike Fleming, they had access to more advanced equipment, greater financial resources through research grants, and most importantly, the biochemical expertise necessary to tackle the formidable challenges of purifying and stabilizing penicillin. The Oxford researchers began their work on penicillin in earnest in 1939, just as Europe descended into war. They grew the Penicillium mold in culture, extracted the antibacterial substance, and worked on methods to concentrate and purify it. Chain developed techniques for freeze-drying the material, which helped preserve its potency. The team made steady progress, though the work was painstakingly slow and yielded only tiny amounts of usable penicillin. Every step forward seemed to reveal new complications. The substance was even more unstable than Fleming had reported, sensitive to heat, pH changes, and countless other factors that could destroy its therapeutic properties in moments. By the spring of 1940, as German forces swept across Western Europe and Britain braced for potential invasion, the Oxford team had accumulated enough penicillin to conduct animal experiments. On May 25, 1940, they performed a crucial test using 8 white mice. 4 mice were injected with a lethal dose of Streptococcus bacteria, then treated with penicillin. 4 others received the same lethal bacterial dose, but no treatment. The results were dramatic and unambiguous. Within hours, all 4 untreated mice had perished from the infection, while all 4 treated mice survived and appeared healthy. This single experiment demonstrated conclusively that penicillin could cure bacterial infections in living organisms, not merely inhibit bacterial growth in laboratory dishes. The successful mouse experiment energized the Oxford team, despite the increasingly dire war situation surrounding them. Britain stood virtually alone against Nazi Germany, enduring nightly bombing raids that threatened not only the civilian population, but also the precious research facilities where this life-saving work was being conducted. The researchers understood that their discovery could have profound implications for treating wounded soldiers, but they faced enormous obstacles in producing enough penicillin to conduct human trials, let alone supply military medical services. Fleury and his colleagues improvised production methods, using whatever containers they could find. Bedpans, pie dishes, milk bottles, and other unlikely vessels were pressed into service as culture containers for growing the Penicillium mold. Every available surface in their laboratory was covered with these makeshift production vessels. The entire team, including scientists who would normally never engage in such manual labor, spent countless hours transferring culture media, harvesting mold, and extracting tiny amounts of penicillin. Despite their Herculean efforts, production remained minuscule, measured in milligrams rather than grams, and each batch represented days of intensive work. Nevertheless, by early 1941, the Oxford team had accumulated enough penicillin to attempt their first human trial. The patient was Albert Alexander, a police constable who had developed a severe bacterial infection after scratching his face on a rose thorn while gardening. The infection had progressed to septicemia, with abscesses forming throughout his body. His condition was terminal, and conventional treatments had proven completely ineffective. With nothing to lose, doctors administered the precious penicillin to Alexander beginning on February 12, 1941. The results were nothing short of miraculous. Within 24 hours, his fever decreased, his appetite returned, and the abscesses began to heal. Tragically, the Oxford team's entire supply of penicillin was exhausted after 5 days of treatment before Alexander's infection was completely eradicated. They even extracted and purified penicillin from his urine to continue treatment, but it was not enough. Without continued therapy, the infection returned with renewed vigor, and Alexander died on March 15, 1941. Despite this heartbreaking outcome, the trial had proven that penicillin could cure bacterial infections in humans, even in cases where death was otherwise certain. What they desperately needed now was a way to produce penicillin in large quantities. As the spring of 1941 arrived, Fleury and Chain understood that Britain, under siege and with limited industrial capacity, devoted almost entirely to weapons production, could not provide the resources necessary for large-scale penicillin manufacturing. They made the bold decision to seek help across the Atlantic, in the United States, where industrial facilities remained intact and the pharmaceutical industry possessed both the expertise and the capacity to tackle the challenge of mass production. This decision would prove to be one of the most consequential choices in medical history, setting in motion a chain of events that would eventually bring penicillin to battlefields around the world. The summer of 1941 found Howard Fleury and Norman Heatley, one of his key research associates, preparing for a journey that would take them across the Atlantic Ocean at a time when German submarines prowled those waters with deadly efficiency. They carried with them something more precious than gold: samples of the Penicillium mold and detailed documentation of their research findings. Fleury understood that this trip represented perhaps the only hope of transforming penicillin from a laboratory achievement into a weapon that could save countless lives in the expanding global conflict. The two scientists departed from Britain in late June 1941, traveling by air across the Atlantic via Portugal and then to the United States, a journey that required multiple days and carried significant risk. Fleury was so concerned about the possibility of enemy agents discovering and stealing the precious mold samples that he and Heatley soaked their coat linings with the Penicillium culture, reasoning that if their luggage was searched or stolen, the most valuable cargo would remain literally on their backs. This seemingly paranoid precaution reflected both the strategic value of what they carried and the very real dangers of the time. Upon arriving in the United States, Fleury and Heatley made their way to the Rockefeller Foundation in New York, which had previously supported some of Fleury's research. Foundation officials recognized the potential significance of penicillin and arranged introductions to key figures in American pharmaceutical research. The scientists were directed to the Northern Regional Research Laboratory in Peoria, Illinois, operated by the United States Department of Agriculture. This facility specialized in fermentation research, focusing primarily on finding industrial uses for agricultural surplus products, but their expertise would prove perfectly suited to the challenge of growing penicillin-producing mold on a larger scale. The laboratory in Peoria, while not initially focused on pharmaceutical research, possessed several advantages that would prove crucial. The facility housed specialists in fermentation technology who had spent years perfecting methods for growing microorganisms in controlled conditions. They had extensive experience with large-scale fermentation processes used in food production and industrial chemistry. Most importantly, they had access to corn-steep liquor, a thick, nutrient-rich byproduct of corn processing that was produced in enormous quantities in the American Midwest. This substance, which had previously been considered waste material of limited value, would become a key ingredient in the revolution that was about to unfold. Dr. Robert Coghill, who directed the fermentation division at the Peoria laboratory, immediately grasped the significance of what Florian Heatley had brought from Oxford. He assembled a team of researchers and technicians to work on the penicillin production problem. Among the most valuable team members was Andrew Jackson Moyer, a specialist in the nutrition of molds who understood the complex biochemistry of fungal growth. Moyer began experimenting with different culture media, testing various combinations of nutrients to determine which would maximize penicillin production by the Penicillium mold. The addition of corn-steep liquor to the culture medium produced dramatic results that exceeded even the optimistic hopes of the research team. Penicillin yields increased exponentially. The mold grown in media containing corn-steep liquor produced up to 10 times more penicillin than the same mold grown in the synthetic media that the Oxford team had been using. This breakthrough meant that the same amount of laboratory space and effort could produce vastly more of the precious antibiotic. However, even this improvement was not sufficient to meet the potential demand for treating military casualties in a global war. Further innovations would be necessary to achieve true mass production. While chemical and nutritional improvements were being developed in Peoria, another crucial element of the penicillin puzzle was being addressed through an unlikely source. The Penicillium notatum strain that Fleming had discovered, and which the Oxford team had been using, was not particularly efficient at producing penicillin even under optimal conditions. Scientists understood that different strains of the same species could vary significantly in their characteristics, and they suspected that somewhere in the world a more productive strain of penicillium might exist. This led to a global search for better penicillin-producing molds, with soil samples being sent to Peoria from around the world. The solution to this problem was discovered not in some exotic location on the far side of the globe, but rather in a fruit market in Peoria itself. Mary Hunt, a laboratory assistant who had been assigned the task of collecting and testing local soil samples, became known among her colleagues as Moldy Mary because of her habit of bringing in any moldy organic material she encountered for testing. One day in 1943, she brought to the laboratory a cantaloupe from a local market that was covered with a golden-colored mold. When this mold was isolated and tested, researchers discovered that it belonged to a different species, Penicillium chrysogenum, and that it produced penicillin at rates far exceeding any strain previously known. The cantaloupe mold, designated as strain NRRL 1951, became the foundation for all subsequent penicillin production. Through careful selection and further research, scientists developed substrains that were even more productive. These improved strains, combined with the optimized growth media containing corn-steep liquor, meant that penicillin production per unit of culture volume increased by factors of hundreds or even thousands compared to the original methods used by Fleming and the Oxford team. Yet even with these remarkable improvements, the question of how to scale up production from laboratory flasks to industrial quantities remained unresolved. Traditional methods of growing mold involved surface culture, spreading the mold across the top of a liquid medium in shallow containers where it would form a mat on the surface, exposed to air. This method was inherently limited in scale because it depended on surface area rather than volume. To produce large quantities of penicillin using surface culture would require enormous facilities with thousands upon thousands of shallow containers, all of which would need to be filled, maintained, harvested, and cleaned, a labor-intensive process that would be impractical for the quantities needed to supply military medical services across multiple theaters of a global war. The solution came from applying deep tank fermentation technology, a process that had been developed for other industrial purposes but had never been used for growing Penicillium mold. In deep tank fermentation, the mold would be grown submerged throughout a large volume of liquid medium, rather than just on the surface. This required solving numerous technical challenges. The mold needed oxygen to grow and produce penicillin, so air would need to be constantly bubbled through the liquid. The culture would need to be stirred to distribute nutrients evenly, and prevent the mold from settling to the bottom. Temperature, pH, and numerous other variables would need to be carefully controlled throughout the fermentation process. Pfizer, a pharmaceutical company that had extensive experience with fermentation technology through its production of citric acid and vitamins, took a leading role in developing deep tank fermentation for penicillin production. The company's chief chemist, Jasper Kane, had pioneered the use of large fermentation tanks for citric acid production, and he recognized that similar techniques could be adapted for penicillin. However, the decision to commit to this approach was not without risk. Penicillium mold was notoriously temperamental, and nobody knew for certain whether it would thrive in submerged culture or whether the deep tank method would prove successful. Kane and his team conducted extensive experiments to determine the optimal conditions for submerged penicillin production. They had to balance numerous competing factors: airflow rates that would provide sufficient oxygen without creating excessive foam, stirring speeds that would distribute nutrients without damaging the delicate mold cells, temperatures that would maximize growth and penicillin production without degrading the antibiotic. Each variable affected the others in complex ways, and finding the right combination required thousands of hours of painstaking experimentation. As these technical developments were progressing in research laboratories, events on the world stage were accelerating in ways that would dramatically increase the urgency of the penicillin project. On December 7, 1941, Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States fully into the Second World War. The United States military, which had been following the penicillin research with interest but without particular urgency, suddenly faced the prospect of fighting simultaneous wars across two oceans against formidable enemies. The need for effective treatment of wounded servicemen became an immediate national priority. President Franklin Roosevelt's administration moved quickly to mobilize American industry for war production. In January 1942, the War Production Board was established to coordinate the allocation of resources and to expedite the production of materials deemed essential to the war effort. Penicillin was placed on the priority list, and pharmaceutical companies were encouraged and supported to develop production capacity. The government provided funding for research and development, allocated scarce materials to penicillin production facilities, and facilitated cooperation between companies that would normally be competitors. The first American patient to be treated with domestically produced penicillin was Ann Miller, a woman suffering from septicemia following a miscarriage. In March 1942, Miller lay dying at New Haven Hospital in Connecticut, her temperature reaching dangerously high levels despite all conventional treatments. Her doctor, recognizing that she had perhaps days to live without intervention, contacted Merck Pharmaceutical Company, which had been working on penicillin production. With special approval from the War Production Board, Merck provided half of their entire existing supply of penicillin, approximately 5 grams, enough for several days of treatment. Miller received her first injection on March 14, 1942, and her response was dramatic. Her fever broke within hours, and she made a complete recovery. Ann Miller's successful treatment demonstrated to American medical authorities and the public what Florey and his team had proven in Britain. Penicillin could cure bacterial infections that were otherwise fatal. Her case received significant media attention, creating public awareness of this new wonder drug and building support for the massive investment in production facilities that would be required to make penicillin widely available. However, the quantities available remained minuscule. By the end of 1942, American production was sufficient to treat fewer than 100 patients. Throughout 1942 and early 1943, pharmaceutical companies invested heavily in developing production capacity. Pfizer committed to building the world's first facility dedicated specifically to large-scale penicillin production using deep tank fermentation. The company purchased an old ice factory in Brooklyn, New York, and converted it into a penicillin production facility. The building was chosen specifically because it already had the refrigeration equipment necessary to maintain the precise temperature control required for the fermentation process. Engineers and construction workers labored around the clock to install massive fermentation tanks and the complex network of pipes, valves, pumps, and monitoring equipment necessary to operate them. Other pharmaceutical companies, including Merck, Squibb, and Abbott Laboratories, developed their own production facilities using various combinations of surface culture and deep tank fermentation methods. The U.S. government facilitated an unprecedented level of cooperation, between these normally competitive companies, encouraging them to share research findings and production techniques. Scientists and engineers from different companies met regularly to discuss their results, their challenges, and their solutions. This collaborative spirit, driven by the shared goal of producing enough penicillin to save the lives of servicemen, created a synergy that accelerated progress beyond what any single company could have achieved alone. As production capacity expanded throughout 1943, the question of how to allocate the limited supplies became increasingly urgent. Military medical authorities understood that penicillin could dramatically reduce mortality and morbidity from wound infections, but initial supplies were far too limited to treat all casualties. The War Production Board maintained strict control over penicillin distribution, and for most of 1943, virtually all production was reserved exclusively for military use. Civilian doctors who were aware of penicillin and its capabilities sometimes made desperate pleas for access to the drug to save dying patients, but such requests were almost always denied due to the overriding priority given to military needs. The first significant battlefield use of penicillin came during the North Africa campaign in 1943. Military medical units received limited supplies and instructions on how to administer the drug to wounded soldiers. Field hospitals began treating severe wound infections, and the results confirmed everything that laboratory research had promised. Soldiers who would have died from overwhelming infections survived. Men who would have required amputations due to gangrenous infections retained their limbs. Recovery times shortened dramatically, allowing wounded soldiers to return to duty weeks or even months earlier than would have been possible with conventional treatment. The dramatic success of penicillin in treating wounded soldiers created a strange paradox for military medical planners as they prepared for the massive operations planned for 1944. They knew that penicillin could save thousands of lives and prevent countless disabilities, but they also knew that supplies would be critically limited. Decisions would have to be made about which casualties would receive this precious treatment and which would be left to recover, or not, with conventional care. These agonizing ethical dilemmas reflected the reality that even with American industrial capacity operating at full capacity, demand for penicillin would far exceed supply for the foreseeable future. The race against time continued, with production expanding as rapidly as possible, while military planners prepared for operations that would generate casualties on an unprecedented scale. By the spring of 1944, penicillin production in the United States had increased exponentially from the minuscule quantities available just 2 years earlier, though supplies remained far short of what military medical planners considered ideal for the massive operations planned for the coming months. The pharmaceutical industry had accomplished what many had considered impossible, transforming a temperamental laboratory curiosity into an industrial product manufactured in facilities operating 24 hours per day, 7 days per week. Fermentation tanks that would have seemed impossibly large just a few years earlier now stood in factories across the United States, each tank containing thousands of gallons of nutrient medium churning, with billions of Penicillium chrysogenum cells producing the life-saving antibiotic. The scale of production increase was staggering when measured against the starting point of Florey and Heatley's journey to America just 3 years earlier. In 1941, the entire world's supply of penicillin could be measured in grams. By early 1944, American factories were producing penicillin in quantities measured in millions of units per month, with production doubling every few months as new facilities came online and existing facilities optimized their processes. Pfizer's Brooklyn facility alone, which had opened in March 1944, contained 14 massive fermentation tanks, each holding 7,500 gallons of culture medium. The factory operated continuously, with shifts of workers monitoring temperature, pH, oxygen levels, and countless other variables that could affect the quality and quantity of penicillin produced. The process of extracting and purifying penicillin from the fermentation broth was itself a complex operation, requiring precision and expertise. After the mold had been allowed to grow and produce penicillin for the optimal period, typically several days, the entire contents of a fermentation tank would be processed through a series of filtration and extraction steps. The mold cells had to be separated from the liquid, which contained the dissolved penicillin. The penicillin then had to be extracted from this liquid, concentrated, and purified to pharmaceutical grade. Each step in this process had to be completed quickly because penicillin degraded rapidly, particularly when exposed to heat or the wrong pH conditions. The final product was typically a yellowish powder or crystalline material that could be dissolved in sterile water just before injection into patients. Packaging and storage required special care. Penicillin had to be kept cool and dry to maintain its potency until it could be used. For military applications, the drug was packaged in small vials containing measured doses, accompanied by vials of sterile water for dissolving the penicillin immediately before injection. These carefully prepared medical supplies were then shipped to distribution centers, where they would be allocated to military medical units according to a priority system that attempted to balance needs across different theaters of operation. As preparations for the Normandy invasion intensified in early 1944, British and American military medical planners worked to ensure that sufficient penicillin would be available to treat the anticipated casualties from what would be the largest amphibious operation in military history. The planners knew from experience in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy that wound infections represented one of the greatest threats to soldiers who survived the initial trauma of their injuries. A soldier could survive the immediate shock of being wounded, only to succumb days later to bacterial infection that overwhelmed his body's natural defenses. Penicillin offered the possibility of preventing this tragic outcome, but only if adequate supplies could be positioned where they would be needed, and if medical personnel were properly trained in its administration. In the weeks leading up to D-Day on June 6, 1944, British medical authorities coordinated the distribution of penicillin supplies across southern England, where casualties from France would be brought for treatment. Emergency medical service hospitals were designated to receive wounded soldiers, and supplies of penicillin were positioned at these facilities. Detailed protocols were developed, specifying how patients treated with penicillin should be identified and tracked. Their medical records would be marked with the word penicillin in block capitals, and they would wear yellow labels marked PEN to ensure that subsequent caregivers would know to continue the treatment at appropriate intervals. The protocols called for penicillin administration to begin as soon after injury as possible, ideally within the first few hours. This early treatment was critical for preventing the establishment of severe infections rather than merely fighting infections that had already taken hold. Medical officers with forward units received training in how to administer penicillin and which types of wounds should receive priority for treatment. The most serious consideration would be given to penetrating wounds of the chest and abdomen, compound fractures, where broken bones had pierced the skin, creating pathways for bacteria to enter deep tissues, and any wounds where there was significant contamination with dirt, debris, or foreign material. On May 24, 1944, less than 2 weeks before the invasion, British medical authorities issued a statement that sufficient supplies of penicillin were now available for the treatment of battlefield casualties, though not yet for ordinary civilian patients. This represented an enormous achievement. In just 3 years, production had increased from levels where a single patient's treatment consumed the entire national supply to levels where tens of thousands of casualties could be treated. However, this abundance was relative. Even with all the production increases achieved by American pharmaceutical companies, penicillin remained scarce enough that every dose had to be carefully allocated and accounted for. When the invasion of Normandy commenced on June 6, 1944, medical units went ashore, carrying precious supplies of penicillin among their equipment. Field hospitals set up in hastily secured areas behind the beaches began receiving wounded soldiers within hours of the initial landings. Medical officers faced desperate situations, casualties streaming in faster than they could be treated, men with terrible wounds that would have been uniformly fatal in previous conflicts, and critical decisions about how to allocate limited resources, including time, blood for transfusions, surgical capacity, and penicillin. The administration of penicillin in battlefield conditions was far removed from the controlled environment of hospital wards in England or America. Injections had to be given every few hours to maintain therapeutic levels in the patient's bloodstream, as penicillin was rapidly eliminated by the kidneys. This meant that even as wounded soldiers were being evacuated from forward aid stations to field hospitals and then to facilities in England, their treatment had to continue uninterrupted. Medical personnel at each stage of the evacuation chain had to coordinate to ensure that the next dose would be ready when needed, a logistical challenge complicated by the chaos of military operations. Despite these challenges, penicillin proved its value in the Normandy campaign beyond any doubt. Medical officers reported that wound infections, which had been a major cause of mortality and morbidity in previous conflicts, occurred far less frequently in soldiers who received early penicillin treatment. Gangrene, one of the most feared complications of war wounds, was dramatically reduced. In previous conflicts, gangrene might affect 20 to 30 soldiers per 1,000 wounded. In Normandy, among soldiers treated with penicillin, the rate dropped to less than 2 per 1,000. This represented not just lives saved, but limbs preserved, disabilities prevented, and soldiers returned to active service who would otherwise have been permanently incapacitated. The success of penicillin in treating Allied casualties created an unintended strategic advantage. American and British forces were able to return recovered soldiers to duty more quickly than their adversaries could. A soldier wounded in combat, but treated successfully with penicillin, might recover and return to his unit in weeks, whereas a German soldier with a similar wound, lacking access to penicillin, might require months to recover or might never return to duty at all. This differential in medical outcomes, multiplied across thousands of casualties, translated into a measurable military advantage beyond the humanitarian benefit of saving lives. Meanwhile, on the other side of the battlefield, German military medical services struggled with the treatment of infected wounds, using methods that had remained largely unchanged since the previous war. German doctors relied primarily on sulfonamide drugs, which had been discovered in Germany in the 1930s, and represented the most advanced antibacterial treatments available to them. Sulfonamides were effective against certain types of bacteria, but were far less powerful and more toxic than penicillin. German medical authorities were aware of penicillin. Scientific literature from before the war had described Fleming's discovery and the early work at Oxford, and intelligence reports brought news of its use by Allied forces. German scientists attempted to produce penicillin, but their efforts were hampered by numerous factors that prevented them from achieving significant success. The deep tank fermentation technology that made mass production possible in the United States had not been developed in Germany. Industrial capacity that might have been devoted to pharmaceutical production was instead directed toward weapons manufacturing. The complex international scientific collaboration that had accelerated penicillin development in Britain and America had no equivalent in Germany, where the regime's policies had driven many of the country's best scientists into exile. Small quantities of penicillin were produced in German laboratories, but nowhere near enough to have any meaningful impact on military medical treatment. Some German military doctors obtained small amounts of penicillin from captured Allied supplies or through other means, and they carefully husbanded these precious quantities for the treatment of high-priority patients. There exists historical documentation of penicillin being used to treat senior German officials, including Adolf Hitler himself after the July 1944 assassination attempt left him with wounds that could have become infected. However, the vast majority of German soldiers wounded on all fronts had no access to penicillin and had to rely on older methods of wound care and infection treatment. As Allied forces advanced across France in the summer and autumn of 1944, penicillin supplies became more readily available. American pharmaceutical production continued to expand, and the supply lines from the United States to Europe became more efficient and secure as Allied naval forces gained control of the Atlantic sea lanes. Medical units were able to treat a larger percentage of casualties with penicillin, and the protocols for its use became more refined based on accumulated experience from treating thousands of wounded soldiers. Captured German soldiers and prisoners of war presented Allied medical services with ethical and practical questions regarding the allocation of penicillin. With supplies still limited, should they be used to treat enemy soldiers, or should they be reserved exclusively for Allied troops? Medical officers in different units and different theaters of operation made varying decisions on this question. Some documentation indicates that German prisoners often received sulfonamide drugs rather than penicillin, even when the latter would have been more effective, because of the need to prioritize limited supplies for Allied soldiers. However, there are also documented instances of Allied medical personnel treating wounded German prisoners with penicillin, particularly in cases of severe infections where sulfonamides were insufficient. As 1944 progressed and Allied forces opened additional fronts in Europe, while continuing operations in the Pacific Theater, penicillin production in the United States reached levels that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. By late 1944, American factories were producing enough penicillin each month to treat hundreds of thousands of patients. The War Production Board began to relax some of the strict allocation rules that had reserved penicillin exclusively for military use, allowing limited supplies to become available for civilian medical emergencies. The day was approaching when penicillin would transition from a scarce resource, requiring agonizing allocation decisions, to a readily available medicine that could be used whenever needed. The experiences gained from treating wounded soldiers with penicillin also provided valuable information about the drug's capabilities and limitations that would benefit civilian medicine in the post-war period. Medical officers learned which types of infections responded well to penicillin treatment and which required different approaches. They discovered optimal dosing schedules and administration routes. They identified potential adverse reactions and complications, though these proved to be remarkably rare. Penicillin was not only effective but also unusually safe, with few patients experiencing significant side effects from the treatment. By the winter of 1944-1945, as Allied forces prepared for the final campaigns that would bring the war in Europe to its conclusion, penicillin had become a standard component of military medical treatment rather than an experimental therapy reserved for special cases. The transformation from Fleming's accidental discovery in a London laboratory to routine battlefield medicine had taken just 16 years, with most of the development compressed into the 3 intense years of American involvement in the war. The lives saved numbered in the tens of thousands already, and the numbers would continue to grow. The winter of 1944-1945 brought particularly fierce combat as Allied forces pushed toward Germany from the west, while Soviet armies advanced from the east, creating a closing vice that would eventually crush the remaining German forces. The Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive operation in the West, began in December 1944 and generated thousands of casualties on both sides as armies clashed in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. American medical units treating wounded soldiers in this campaign had access to penicillin supplies that would have been unimaginable just a year earlier, and the impact on survival rates and recovery outcomes was dramatic. Medical officers serving in forward hospitals during the Ardennes campaign documented their experiences treating penetrating wounds, compound fractures, and severe soft tissue injuries under conditions that were far from ideal. Hospital tents and temporary facilities offered limited protection from the bitter cold, making it challenging to maintain the sterile conditions that medical procedures required. Yet even in these difficult circumstances, the administration of penicillin to wounded soldiers produced remarkable results. Infections that would have been expected to develop in the days following treatment often simply did not occur, or if they did develop, they responded readily to continued penicillin therapy. The protocols for penicillin administration had become increasingly refined based on accumulated experience from multiple theaters of operation. Medical personnel understood that early treatment was crucial. Penicillin was most effective when given as soon after injury as possible, ideally beginning within the first few hours. The drug was typically administered through intramuscular injection, with doses repeated every 3 to 4 hours to maintain therapeutic levels in the bloodstream. For particularly severe infections, or in cases where there was extensive tissue damage, higher doses or more frequent administration might be employed. One of the most significant discoveries from battlefield use of penicillin was its effectiveness in preventing gas gangrene, a devastating condition caused by Clostridium bacteria that could quickly spread through traumatized tissue, producing toxins and gas that literally destroyed muscle and other soft tissues. Gas gangrene had been one of the most feared complications of war wounds since the First World War, often requiring extensive surgical removal of infected tissue and frequently resulting in amputations or death. The introduction of penicillin, combined with improved surgical techniques for cleaning and removing dead tissue from wounds, reduced gas gangrene to a relatively rare occurrence among Allied troops who received prompt medical treatment. The differential in medical outcomes between Allied and German forces became increasingly pronounced as the war entered its final months. Allied soldiers wounded in combat had a reasonable expectation of survival and recovery if they received medical treatment promptly. German soldiers faced grimmer prospects as their medical services struggled with dwindling supplies of even basic medications, overwhelming numbers of casualties, and the breakdown of evacuation systems as transportation networks were disrupted by Allied air superiority. The absence of penicillin from German military medicine meant that infections remained a major cause of mortality and long-term disability among wounded German troops. As Allied forces advanced into German territory in early 1945, they began capturing hospitals and medical facilities where German wounded were being treated. Allied medical officers who inspected these captured facilities were often struck by the contrast between the supplies and capabilities available to German medical services and those available to their Allied counterparts. German military hospitals might have skilled surgeons and dedicated medical personnel, but they lacked the wonder drug that had transformed infection treatment. Some captured German medical officers expressed amazement when they learned about the quantities of penicillin available to Allied medical units. The question of how to treat captured German soldiers who were suffering from infected wounds created difficult ethical situations for Allied medical services. Resources were finite, and there remained a natural inclination to prioritize care for Allied soldiers over enemy troops. However, medical ethics and international humanitarian law required that prisoners of war receive adequate medical care. Different Allied medical units reached different accommodations on this question. Some treated German prisoners with penicillin when their conditions warranted it, while others reserved penicillin for Allied troops and treated prisoners with sulfonamide drugs, which, while less effective than penicillin, were more readily available and represented the standard of care that German forces themselves employed. Documentation from prisoner of war camps indicates that Allied medical personnel sometimes administered penicillin to German prisoners who developed severe infections while in custody. These treatments saved lives and prevented complications that would have required more extensive medical intervention. In some instances, German soldiers who had been wounded and captured by Allied forces received better medical treatment than they would have obtained in their own military medical facilities, particularly if their wounds occurred late in the war, when German medical services were severely stressed. The Allied advance into Germany also revealed the extent of German attempts to develop penicillin production capability. Intelligence teams examining captured pharmaceutical facilities and research laboratories found evidence of penicillin research programs, but these efforts had never achieved significant success. German scientists working on penicillin faced multiple obstacles: lack of the crucial deep tank fermentation technology, insufficient industrial capacity, inadequate supplies of necessary materials, and the general degradation of German industrial capability under sustained Allied bombing. Some facilities had managed to produce small quantities of penicillin, but nothing approaching the scale necessary to supply military medical needs. By the spring of 1945, as German resistance collapsed and the war in Europe entered its final weeks, penicillin had become so readily available to Allied forces that its use was no longer restricted to life-threatening situations. Medical units could now use penicillin prophylactically for a wider range of wounds and medical conditions. The drug that had been more precious than gold just 2 years earlier was now available in quantities sufficient for what earlier would have been considered routine cases. This abundance reflected the extraordinary success of American pharmaceutical production, which by mid-1945 was manufacturing penicillin in quantities that exceeded even optimistic projections from just a year earlier. The end of the war in Europe in May 1945 brought new considerations regarding penicillin supplies and their distribution. With combat operations concluded on the European continent, the immediate demand for penicillin to treat battlefield casualties diminished substantially. However, there remained significant need for treating Allied soldiers recovering from wounds received during the fighting, former prisoners of war who required medical care after liberation from German camps, and displaced persons suffering from various diseases and infections in the chaotic aftermath of the conflict. American military authorities made the decision to provide penicillin supplies to help treat civilian populations in liberated areas of Europe, where disease and infection were widespread due to wartime disruption of public health infrastructure. This humanitarian use of penicillin represented a significant expansion from its original purpose of treating military casualties. Medical teams working with refugee populations and in areas where sanitation systems had been destroyed by combat found penicillin valuable for treating a wide range of bacterial infections that flourished in the unsanitary conditions prevailing in many areas immediately after the war's end. The question of how to treat former German soldiers who remained in prisoner of war camps or who required ongoing medical care presented interesting challenges during the transition from wartime to peacetime. With the war concluded, the ethical imperative to provide adequate medical care to former enemy combatants became clearer, and penicillin was increasingly used to treat infections among German prisoners of war held in Allied custody. Some German medical officers who had been captured during the final campaigns of the war witnessed firsthand the capabilities of penicillin, having had no previous opportunity to observe its effects, despite being aware of its existence through scientific literature and intelligence reports. As American attention shifted from the European theater to the ongoing war against Japan in the Pacific, penicillin supplies were redirected to support operations in that theater. The conditions in the Pacific presented different medical challenges than those in Europe: tropical diseases, different patterns of wounds from jungle warfare, and logistical difficulties in maintaining supply lines across vast ocean distances. Penicillin proved equally valuable in the Pacific theater for treating wound infections and certain tropical diseases caused by bacterial pathogens. Throughout 1945, even as military demand for penicillin remained substantial due to ongoing operations in the Pacific, American pharmaceutical production had increased to the point where supplies could be made available for civilian use within the United States. On March 15, 1945, penicillin became available through ordinary pharmacies for civilian patients with prescriptions from their doctors. This transition from military monopoly to civilian availability represented a milestone in medical history. A drug that had not existed in practical form just 5 years earlier was now accessible to the general public. The wartime development of penicillin production had created a pharmaceutical industry infrastructure that would prove valuable in the post-war period. The fermentation facilities, the expertise in large-scale antibiotic production, and the research capabilities that had been built to produce penicillin would become the foundation for developing additional antibiotics in subsequent years. The collaborative model of pharmaceutical research and development that had emerged during the war, with government support facilitating cooperation between normally competitive companies, established patterns that would influence pharmaceutical development for decades to come. The experience of military medical services in using penicillin during combat operations provided a wealth of clinical data that would inform civilian medical practice in the post-war era. Military doctors had treated penicillin cases representing a wider range of infections and conditions than would have been possible in any civilian medical research program. They had learned which infections responded well to penicillin, which required higher doses or longer treatment courses, and which types of bacteria were resistant to the drug. This knowledge, systematically documented in medical journals and military medical reports, became available to the entire medical profession. By August 1945, when Japan surrendered following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, penicillin had saved an estimated hundreds of thousands of lives among Allied military personnel. The exact numbers would never be known with certainty, but medical historians who have studied mortality rates from wound infections in different conflicts have documented that the death rate from infected wounds was dramatically lower in the Second World War than in previous conflicts, with penicillin being the primary factor explaining this difference. Beyond the lives saved outright, countless amputations were prevented, disabilities avoided, and suffering reduced because infected wounds could be treated effectively rather than requiring extensive surgical removal of infected tissue. The transformation that penicillin had wrought in military medicine during just 4 years of intensive development and deployment represented one of the most remarkable achievements in medical history. What had begun as Fleming's accidental observation of mold contamination in a petri dish had evolved through Florian Chain's Oxford research, crossed the Atlantic to mobilize American pharmaceutical ingenuity, and ultimately reached battlefields around the world where it saved lives on a scale that the early researchers could hardly have imagined. Yet the full story of penicillin's impact was still unfolding, and some of its most interesting chapters would concern not only the Allied soldiers whose lives were saved, but also those on the other side of the conflict. Throughout the war years, German medical services operated under increasingly difficult conditions as the conflict progressed and their nation's strategic situation deteriorated. German military doctors were highly trained professionals who understood the latest developments in medical science, yet they found themselves unable to access one of the most significant medical advances of the era. The story of German awareness of penicillin, their attempts to develop their own production capability, and their ultimate failure to do so, reveals the complex interplay between science, industrial capacity, and national priorities during wartime. German scientists were well aware of Alexander Fleming's 1928 discovery of penicillin's antibacterial properties. German scientific journals had published abstracts and discussions of Fleming's work, and the international scientific community before the war had maintained regular communication across national boundaries. When Howard Florey and Ernst Chain published their groundbreaking research in 1940, demonstrating penicillin's therapeutic potential in animal experiments, German medical researchers read those publications with great interest. The German medical establishment understood that penicillin represented a potentially transformative advancement in treating bacterial infections. Several German pharmaceutical companies and research institutes initiated programs to develop penicillin production capability in the early years of the war. These efforts were hampered from the beginning by multiple factors that would ultimately prevent them from achieving meaningful success. German researchers succeeded in culturing Penicillium mold and producing small quantities of penicillin in laboratory settings, demonstrating that they possessed the basic scientific knowledge necessary for production. However, translating this laboratory-scale capability into industrial production proved impossible under wartime conditions. The deep tank fermentation technology that had been crucial to American success in scaling up penicillin production had not been developed in Germany. German pharmaceutical industry had focused on synthetic chemistry rather than fermentation-based production methods, reflecting different historical development paths in the two countries' chemical industries. While American companies like Pfizer had extensive experience with large-scale fermentation for producing citric acid and other compounds, German pharmaceutical firms had concentrated on synthesizing drugs through chemical processes. This difference in expertise and infrastructure meant that German researchers attempting to produce penicillin had to develop fermentation technology from scratch while simultaneously trying to optimize penicillin production. Industrial capacity constraints represented another fundamental obstacle to German penicillin development. By 1942 and 1943, when American pharmaceutical companies were building dedicated penicillin production facilities and installing massive fermentation tanks, German industrial capacity was increasingly strained by the demands of weapons production and the effects of Allied strategic bombing. The copper and stainless steel required for fermentation equipment were strategic materials needed for military purposes. The industrial labor force necessary to construct and operate pharmaceutical production facilities was needed elsewhere. The allocation of scarce resources to speculative pharmaceutical development was difficult to justify when more immediate military needs went unmet. German penicillin research programs also suffered from the regime's policies that had driven many of Germany's most talented scientists into exile during the 1930s. The very scientists who might have made crucial contributions to pharmaceutical development had fled Germany due to racial persecution or political opposition to the regime. Ernst Chain himself, who had been instrumental in penicillin development at Oxford, was a German Jewish biochemist who had left Germany in 1933. The loss of such talent represented a self-inflicted wound to German scientific capability that had consequences extending far beyond penicillin development. Despite these obstacles, some German facilities managed to produce limited quantities of penicillin. Historical research into German penicillin programs has documented that several laboratories and small-scale production facilities were operating by 1943 and 1944, producing penicillin in amounts measured in grams or perhaps kilograms, rather than the tons being manufactured in American facilities. These precious small quantities were reserved for high-priority cases, including treatment of senior officials, and occasionally for wounded soldiers in critical condition where conventional treatments had failed. The German scientific community's awareness of their disadvantage regarding penicillin created interesting dynamics within their medical establishment. Some German medical researchers who had access to international scientific literature could see the dramatic advances being made in Allied countries, yet they were powerless to replicate those achievements under their circumstances. This created a sense of professional frustration among physicians who understood that their patients were dying from infections that could be cured if only they had access to adequate supplies of penicillin. Medical personnel serving on various fronts wrote reports describing their experiences, treating severe infections with limited resources, often expressing hope that German pharmaceutical industry would eventually solve the production problems. The strategic bombing campaign against German industrial targets also disrupted what penicillin production capability did exist. Allied intelligence services were aware of German attempts to develop antibiotic production, and pharmaceutical facilities were occasionally targeted in bombing raids aimed at degrading German medical and scientific capabilities. By late 1944, the combination of resource shortages, bombing damage, and the general breakdown of industrial coordination had essentially eliminated any meaningful German penicillin production. The small facilities that had managed to produce limited quantities earlier in the war were either destroyed, abandoned, or unable to obtain the materials necessary to continue operation. The contrast between German and Allied medical capabilities became starkly apparent in the treatment of wounded prisoners of war on both sides. German prisoners captured by Allied forces often received medical treatment that was superior to what they would have obtained in their own military medical system, particularly if their wounds became infected. Allied medical personnel documented cases where German prisoners suffering from severe wound infections were successfully treated with penicillin after conventional treatments had failed. Some of these prisoners later expressed amazement at the rapid healing they experienced compared to the prolonged recovery periods they had observed among their comrades treated in German facilities. Conversely, Allied prisoners held in German camps faced medical conditions that reflected the resource constraints affecting all of German military medicine. While Geneva Convention requirements mandated that prisoners of war receive adequate medical care, the reality was that German camp medical facilities often lacked even basic medications, much less advanced treatments like penicillin. Allied prisoners who developed infections while in German custody typically received whatever sulfonamide drugs were available, but these were often in short supply and less effective than penicillin for many types of bacterial infections. The intelligence reports compiled by Allied forces as they advanced into German territory during 1945 provided detailed insights into German medical capabilities and their attempts to develop penicillin production. Teams of scientists and medical officers examined captured facilities, interviewed German medical personnel, and documented the extent of German pharmaceutical research. These reports revealed that while German scientists possessed sophisticated theoretical knowledge about penicillin and antibiotic development, they had been unable to translate this knowledge into practical production capability on the scale needed for military medical purposes. Some of the most interesting documentation from this period involves German medical officers who were captured late in the war and who had the opportunity to observe Allied medical facilities firsthand. Their written reports and post-war interviews reveal a mixture of professional admiration and strategic concern about the medical advantages that penicillin provided to Allied forces. These German physicians understood that penicillin represented more than just a medical advance. It was a strategic asset that improved Allied military effectiveness by returning wounded soldiers to duty more quickly and maintaining higher morale among troops who knew that effective medical treatment was available if they were wounded. The German experience with penicillin development illustrated broader patterns about wartime scientific and industrial priorities. The regime's focus on immediate military needs often came at the expense of longer-term research and development projects that might have provided strategic advantages. Resources that might have been devoted to pharmaceutical development were instead allocated to weapons production or other military priorities that offered more immediate tactical benefits. This short-term thinking, combined with the loss of scientific talent due to political persecution, handicapped German efforts to compete with Allied technological and medical advances. As the war drew to its close in the spring of 1945, the medical implications of penicillin availability extended beyond the immediate treatment of wounded soldiers. Post-war planning documents prepared by both military and civilian authorities recognized that penicillin would transform civilian medicine as well as military medical practice. The infrastructure built for wartime penicillin production could be converted to peacetime pharmaceutical manufacturing, potentially making antibiotics available for treating civilian infections that had previously been untreatable or frequently fatal. The broader scientific and medical community was beginning to understand that penicillin represented just the beginning of what would eventually be called the antibiotic era. Research programs were already underway to identify and develop additional antibiotics that might be effective against bacteria resistant to penicillin, or that might offer advantages in treating different types of infections. The collaborative research model that had emerged during wartime penicillin development, combining academic research, government funding, and industrial production capabilities, would become the template for pharmaceutical development in the post-war era. For German medical personnel and scientists, the end of the war brought opportunities to learn about the full extent of Allied medical advances that had been hidden from them during the conflict. Many German physicians who had struggled throughout the war to treat infections with limited resources now had the chance to observe penicillin treatment firsthand and to understand how dramatically it could improve patient outcomes. This knowledge would prove valuable as Germany began rebuilding its medical and pharmaceutical capabilities in the post-war period under Allied occupation. The irony was not lost on medical historians, who later examined this period, that some of the key scientific foundations for penicillin development had originated in Germany through the work of scientists like Ernst Chain, who had been forced to flee the country due to political persecution. The brain drain caused by the regime's policies had deprived Germany of some of the very expertise that might have enabled successful penicillin development, while simultaneously strengthening the Allied research efforts that these scientists joined after emigrating. As both sides prepared for the post-war reconstruction period, the lessons learned from wartime medical development would influence pharmaceutical research and public health policy for decades to come. The success of penicillin development demonstrated the potential for rapid scientific progress when adequate resources were allocated and when collaborative research efforts were properly coordinated. These lessons would prove valuable not only for developing additional antibiotics, but also for addressing other medical challenges that would emerge in the post-war era. The spring of 1945 brought the collapse of the Third Reich and the revelation of the full scope of wartime destruction across Europe. As Allied forces advanced into German territory, they encountered not only military targets and strategic facilities, but also civilian populations devastated by years of conflict, malnutrition, and disease. The liberation of concentration camps revealed horrific conditions where disease ran rampant among prisoners who had been subjected to systematic starvation and abuse. In this humanitarian crisis, penicillin would play a role that extended far beyond its original military applications, demonstrating the broader implications of medical advances developed during wartime. Medical personnel accompanying Allied forces into liberated areas faced challenges that differed significantly from treating battlefield casualties. In the concentration camps, they encountered thousands of survivors suffering from typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, and countless other infections that flourished in the unsanitary conditions that had prevailed during the final chaotic months of the war. Many liberated prisoners were so weakened by prolonged malnutrition that their immune systems could not fight off even relatively minor infections that would normally pose little threat to healthy individuals. The decision to use precious penicillin supplies to treat civilian populations in liberated areas represented a significant policy shift from the strict military allocation that had characterized distribution throughout the war. Military medical commanders, working in coordination with civilian relief organizations, determined that humanitarian considerations justified using some portion of available supplies for treating disease among displaced persons, concentration camp survivors, and civilian populations in areas where public health infrastructure had been destroyed by combat operations. The treatment of concentration camp survivors with penicillin produced dramatic results that were documented by medical personnel and relief workers. Prisoners who had been expected to die from overwhelming infections recovered when treated with the antibiotic. Typhus patients who had been given up for lost showed remarkable improvement within days of beginning treatment. The psychological impact of this effective medical intervention extended beyond the immediate clinical benefits. Survivors who had lost all hope began to believe in the possibility of recovery and return to normal life. However, the use of penicillin in these humanitarian situations also revealed some of the drug's limitations and the complexity of treating patients who were severely compromised by malnutrition and prolonged suffering. Some infections did not respond to penicillin treatment, either because they were caused by bacteria that were naturally resistant to the antibiotic, or because the patients were too weakened to mount an effective immune response even with antibiotic support. Medical personnel learned that penicillin was a powerful tool but not a universal solution to all infectious disease problems. The allocation of penicillin for humanitarian purposes also created difficult ethical dilemmas for medical commanders who had finite supplies and competing demands. Should priority be given to Allied soldiers who might still be wounded in ongoing operations in the Pacific Theater? Should former enemy civilians receive the same access to treatment as concentration camp survivors? How should scarce resources be distributed among thousands of potential patients when there was not enough medication to treat everyone who might benefit from it? Different Allied commands reached different conclusions about these questions, leading to variations in policy across liberated areas. Some medical units reserved penicillin primarily for Allied military personnel and concentration camp survivors, while others included German civilian populations in their treatment protocols. These decisions often reflected the personal judgment of individual medical commanders rather than standardized policies, resulting in inconsistent access to treatment depending on local circumstances and the attitudes of particular medical officers. The experience of treating diverse populations with penicillin during the immediate post-war period provided valuable clinical data that would inform peacetime medical practice. Medical personnel treating concentration camp survivors learned about the drug's effectiveness in severely malnourished patients. They discovered optimal dosing strategies for treating patients with multiple concurrent infections. They identified complications and side effects that had not been apparent in previous clinical experience with healthier military personnel. One of the most significant developments during this period was the recognition that penicillin could be effective in treating certain cases of tuberculosis, though not as dramatically as with other bacterial infections. Tuberculosis had been one of the major killers in the concentration camps, and medical personnel found that while penicillin did not cure tuberculosis in the way that it cured wound infections, it could be helpful in treating some of the secondary infections that often complicated tuberculosis cases. This discovery would eventually lead to research into more specific anti-tuberculosis drugs in the post-war period. The humanitarian use of penicillin also demonstrated the importance of adequate nutrition and general medical support in maximizing the effectiveness of antibiotic treatment. Patients who received penicillin along with proper nutrition and supportive care recovered more quickly and completely than those who received the antibiotic alone while remaining malnourished. This observation reinforced the understanding that antibiotics, while powerful, were most effective when used as part of comprehensive medical care rather than as isolated treatments. As news of penicillin's humanitarian applications spread through press reports and official communications, public awareness of the drug's potential expanded beyond its military applications. Civilian populations in countries not directly involved in the conflict began to understand that this new medication might eventually become available for treating common infections that had previously been serious threats to public health. This growing awareness created pressure on governments and pharmaceutical companies to make penicillin available for civilian use as quickly as possible. The transition from wartime to peacetime production and distribution of penicillin required significant reorganization of the pharmaceutical industry infrastructure that had been built during the war. Facilities that had been constructed specifically for military production needed to be converted for civilian medical use. Distribution systems that had been designed to supply military medical units needed to be replaced with systems capable of serving civilian hospitals and private medical practitioners. On March 15, 1945, penicillin became available through civilian pharmacies in the United States for the first time, marking a historic transition from military monopoly to public availability. The first civilian patients to receive penicillin prescriptions often had conditions that would have been untreatable just a few years earlier. Physicians who had read about penicillin in medical journals but had never been able to prescribe it due to military allocation restrictions suddenly had access to a treatment option that could cure infections they had previously been unable to address effectively. The price of penicillin for civilian use was initially quite high, reflecting both the limited production capacity available for non-military applications and the substantial investment that pharmaceutical companies had made in developing production facilities. However, as production continued to expand and more companies entered the market, prices dropped rapidly. By late 1945, penicillin was becoming affordable enough for routine use in civilian medical practice, though it remained more expensive than older treatments and was still rationed in many locations. The success of penicillin in both military and humanitarian applications stimulated increased investment in pharmaceutical research aimed at discovering additional antibiotics. Pharmaceutical companies that had gained expertise in antibiotic production during the war began systematic programs to search for other microorganisms that might produce useful antimicrobial compounds. Academic research institutions initiated studies of the mechanisms by which antibiotics worked, hoping to design more effective treatments for specific types of infections. The international implications of penicillin development also became apparent during the immediate post-war period. Countries that had not participated in wartime penicillin research found themselves at a significant disadvantage in terms of pharmaceutical manufacturing capability. This created opportunities for technology transfer and international cooperation in pharmaceutical development, but also established patterns of dependence on American and British pharmaceutical companies that would persist for decades. German pharmaceutical scientists and companies operating under Allied occupation faced particular challenges in rebuilding their antibiotic development capabilities. Many of the facilities that had attempted penicillin production during the war had been damaged or destroyed, and the scientists who had worked on these projects were scattered or had fled the country. Rebuilding required both physical reconstruction and the recruitment of new scientific talent, often with assistance from Allied technical advisors who were willing to share some of the knowledge that had been developed during the war. The success of wartime penicillin development also influenced post-war science policy in many countries. Governments that had seen the strategic value of pharmaceutical research began to invest more heavily in peacetime medical research programs. The collaborative model that had emerged during wartime, combining academic research, government funding, and industrial development, became the template for addressing peacetime medical challenges such as cancer, heart disease, and mental health conditions. For individual patients and their families, the availability of penicillin represented a fundamental change in the prognosis for many previously serious medical conditions. Parents no longer had to watch helplessly as their children died from infections that followed minor injuries. Surgical patients could undergo operations with much lower risk of post-operative complications. Physicians could treat bacterial pneumonia with confidence that their patients would likely recover, rather than face the high mortality rates that had characterized the disease in previous decades. The broader social implications of penicillin's success extended beyond medicine into areas such as public health policy, medical education, and healthcare economics. Medical schools needed to revise their curricula to include instruction in antibiotic therapy. Public health authorities had to develop new approaches to infection control that took into account the availability of effective treatments. Healthcare systems needed to adapt to a new economic reality in which expensive but highly effective treatments were becoming available for common conditions. As 1945 drew to a close and the world began to transition from wartime emergency to peacetime reconstruction, penicillin stood as one of the most visible and successful examples of what could be achieved when scientific knowledge, industrial capability, and social commitment were combined to address urgent human needs. The lessons learned from this experience would influence approaches to medical research and development for generations to come, establishing principles that continue to guide pharmaceutical innovation in the 21st century. By the end of 1945, as the world emerged from the most devastating conflict in human history, penicillin had fundamentally transformed the landscape of medical practice in ways that extended far beyond the battlefields where it had first proved its worth. The production capacity that had been built to supply military medical needs during wartime was being rapidly converted to serve civilian populations, creating the foundation for what would become the modern pharmaceutical industry. The implications of this transformation would reshape medicine, public health, and society itself for generations to come. The statistical evidence of penicillin's impact on military medical outcomes provided compelling proof of its revolutionary significance. Mortality rates from wound infections during the Second World War were dramatically lower than those recorded in previous conflicts, despite the increased lethality of modern weapons and the massive scale of combat operations. Medical historians analyzing casualty data documented that the death rate from infected wounds was reduced by approximately 70% compared to the First World War, with penicillin being the primary factor explaining this improvement. The number of lives saved could be calculated in the hundreds of thousands among Allied forces alone. Beyond the immediate life-saving impact, penicillin had also prevented countless amputations and disabilities that would have resulted from severe wound infections. Soldiers who might have lost limbs to gangrene instead recovered with full function and returned to productive civilian lives after the war. The economic value of these prevented disabilities, calculated in terms of lifetime productivity and reduced healthcare costs, represented benefits that far exceeded the investment made in penicillin development and production during the war years. The rapid transition to civilian availability created a medical revolution that touched every aspect of healthcare practice. Bacterial pneumonia, which had been called the captain of the men of death due to its high mortality rate, suddenly became a readily treatable condition. Childhood diseases such as scarlet fever and bacterial meningitis, which had previously killed thousands of children annually, could now be cured with antibiotic treatment. The transformation was so dramatic that physicians who had practiced medicine before penicillin availability sometimes struggled to adjust to the new therapeutic possibilities at their disposal. The success of penicillin also validated the potential of systematic pharmaceutical research and development, encouraging massive investments in discovering additional antibiotics and other types of medicines. Pharmaceutical companies that had gained expertise in fermentation technology during wartime penicillin production applied these capabilities to searching for other antibiotic-producing microorganisms. The discovery of streptomycin, chloramphenicol, tetracycline, and numerous other antibiotics in the following years created an entire arsenal of antimicrobial weapons that gave physicians unprecedented power to treat infectious diseases. The collaborative research model that had emerged during wartime penicillin development became the standard approach for pharmaceutical innovation. The combination of academic research, government funding, and industrial development that had made mass penicillin production possible was replicated for other medical challenges. This model would prove essential in addressing post-war health priorities, such as developing vaccines for polio, treating cancer, and addressing mental health conditions. The institutional frameworks created during the penicillin project laid the groundwork for the National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control, and other organizations that would lead medical research in the decades to come. The international implications of penicillin development also became increasingly significant as the Cold War began to emerge in the late 1940s. The United States and Britain had gained a substantial advantage in pharmaceutical manufacturing capability that translated into both economic benefits and strategic influence. Countries seeking access to modern medical treatments often had to establish relationships with American or British pharmaceutical companies, creating dependencies that influenced international relations. The technology transfer and licensing agreements that brought penicillin production to other countries became models for broader patterns of technological and economic cooperation. The education and training of medical personnel had to be completely revised to incorporate antibiotic therapy into standard practice. Medical schools developed new curricula that taught students how to diagnose bacterial infections, select appropriate antibiotics, determine proper dosages, and monitor patients for treatment effectiveness and potential side effects. Practicing physicians attended continuing education programs to learn about antibiotic use, fundamentally changing treatment protocols that had remained essentially unchanged for decades. Hospital practices and infection control procedures were revolutionized by the availability of effective antibiotic treatments. Preoperative preparation could include prophylactic antibiotic administration to prevent post-surgical infections. Patients with compromised immune systems could be protected with antibiotics during vulnerable periods. Infection control protocols could be designed around the assumption that bacterial infections would be treatable if they occurred, allowing for more aggressive surgical interventions and treatment approaches that would have been too risky in the pre-antibiotic era. The economic impact of penicillin availability extended far beyond the healthcare sector. Reduced mortality and morbidity from infectious diseases meant that workers remained productive throughout their careers rather than being disabled or killed by preventable infections. The costs of long-term care for patients with chronic complications from untreated infections were largely eliminated. Healthcare systems could allocate resources to other priorities rather than devoting enormous effort to managing the consequences of bacterial infections that could now be prevented or cured. Public health authorities faced the challenge of adapting their strategies to incorporate antibiotic therapy into disease prevention and control programs. Traditional approaches that relied primarily on sanitation, quarantine, and supportive care had to be supplemented with treatment protocols that could cure established infections. This shift required new training for public health personnel, revised disease surveillance systems, and updated emergency response procedures for managing infectious disease outbreaks. The social implications of effective antibiotic therapy were equally profound. Families no longer lived under the constant threat that minor injuries or common illnesses might lead to death from secondary infections. Parents could allow their children to engage in normal activities without the overwhelming fear of infection that had characterized previous generations. The psychological burden of infectious disease was lifted from entire populations, contributing to the optimism and confidence that characterized many societies in the immediate post-war period. The success of penicillin also raised important questions about healthcare equity and access to medical advances. While the drug was becoming increasingly available in developed countries, much of the world's population still lacked access to this life-saving treatment. The disparity between countries with advanced pharmaceutical industries and those without created ethical dilemmas about how medical advances should be distributed globally. These questions would become increasingly important as additional medical breakthroughs emerged in subsequent decades. The industrial infrastructure created for penicillin production during the war provided the foundation for pharmaceutical manufacturing that continues to serve global health needs in the 21st century. The fermentation technology, quality control procedures, and distribution systems developed for wartime production established standards and practices that influenced pharmaceutical manufacturing worldwide. Many of the companies that participated in wartime penicillin production became the major pharmaceutical corporations that continue to develop and manufacture antibiotics and other medicines today. The scientific knowledge gained from penicillin research also contributed to broader understanding of biochemistry, microbiology, and pharmacology that advanced medical science in numerous directions. The mechanisms by which penicillin worked, disrupting bacterial cell wall formation, provided insights into bacterial physiology that led to additional therapeutic targets. The techniques developed for isolating, purifying, and testing antibiotics became standard methods for pharmaceutical research. The clinical trial procedures used to evaluate penicillin effectiveness established protocols that continue to guide drug development today. For the generation of physicians who had witnessed the transformation from the pre-antibiotic to the antibiotic era, the experience was nothing short of miraculous. Doctors who had watched patients die from infections that are now easily treatable never forgot the revolutionary impact of effective antimicrobial therapy. Their accounts of this transformation, recorded in medical journals and autobiographical writings, provide compelling testimony to the magnitude of change that penicillin brought to medical practice. The story of penicillin development also demonstrated the importance of basic scientific research that might not have obvious immediate applications. Fleming's initial observation of antibacterial activity in his contaminated Petri dish was a curious scientific finding with no apparent practical relevance at the time. Only through the sustained efforts of researchers who recognized its potential and the mobilization of enormous resources during wartime was this observation transformed into a practical therapy that saved millions of lives. This experience influenced science policy for decades, supporting arguments for funding basic research, even when immediate applications were not apparent. As the world moved into the second half of the 20th century, penicillin stood as proof that human ingenuity, scientific knowledge, and collaborative effort could overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. The transformation from Fleming's accidental discovery to mass-produced life-saving medication in less than 2 decades represented one of humanity's greatest achievements in medical science. The lessons learned from this experience would guide approaches to addressing other health challenges, from developing vaccines to treating cancer to combating emerging infectious diseases. The legacy of wartime penicillin development continues to influence medicine and society today. The antibiotics that descended from penicillin remain essential tools for treating bacterial infections, though their effectiveness is now threatened by the emergence of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. The collaborative research model pioneered during penicillin development continues to guide pharmaceutical innovation. The industrial infrastructure created for antibiotic production provides the foundation for manufacturing the medicines that treat countless conditions. Most importantly, the example of penicillin demonstrates that even the most challenging medical problems can be solved when scientific knowledge, industrial capability, and social commitment are combined in pursuit of saving human lives. 7 decades after the end of the Second World War, the story of penicillin's development and deployment continues to resonate as one of the most remarkable achievements in medical history. What began as Alexander Fleming's chance observation in a London laboratory ultimately saved millions of lives and fundamentally transformed the practice of medicine worldwide. The rapid progression from laboratory curiosity to life-saving therapy demonstrated humanity's capacity for innovation and collaboration in the face of urgent need. The immediate impact of penicillin during the war years represented only the beginning of its broader influence on human health and society. In the decades following the conflict, antibiotics revolutionized medical treatment across virtually every specialty. Surgical procedures that had been prohibitively risky due to infection became routine. Childhood mortality from bacterial diseases plummeted. Infectious diseases that had plagued humanity for millennia were brought under control, allowing populations to focus on addressing other health challenges such as cancer, heart disease, and mental illness. The industrial and scientific infrastructure created during wartime penicillin development provided the foundation for the modern pharmaceutical industry. The collaborative research model that emerged from the urgent need to mass-produce penicillin became the standard approach for developing new medicines. The regulatory frameworks, quality control procedures, and clinical trial methodologies established during this period continue to guide pharmaceutical development today. The investment in fermentation technology and biotechnology that began with penicillin production laid the groundwork for industries that now produce not only antibiotics, but also vaccines, hormones, and countless other biological products. Perhaps most significantly, the success of penicillin development demonstrated that systematic scientific research, adequately funded and properly coordinated, could solve medical problems that had previously seemed insurmountable. This lesson influenced science policy throughout the post-war period, leading to massive investments in medical research that produced vaccines for polio, treatments for cancer, organ transplantation techniques, and countless other medical advances. The National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control, and similar organizations around the world were built on foundations established during the urgent mobilization for penicillin production. The story of penicillin also illustrates the complex relationship between warfare and medical progress. While the devastation of the Second World War was tragic beyond measure, the urgent need to treat wounded soldiers created the political will and resource allocation necessary to transform a laboratory discovery into a practical therapy at unprecedented speed. The collaborative spirit that emerged from shared commitment to saving lives overcame normal competitive barriers between companies and countries, demonstrating what could be achieved when humanity united around common humanitarian goals. The ethical dimensions of penicillin allocation during the war years raised questions that continue to challenge medical ethics today. The decisions about which patients should receive scarce medical resources, whether enemy soldiers deserved the same level of care as friendly forces, and how to balance military needs against humanitarian concerns foreshadowed similar dilemmas that arise whenever life-saving treatments are in limited supply. The frameworks developed for addressing these questions during the penicillin era influenced approaches to medical triage, resource allocation, and healthcare equity that remain relevant in contemporary medical practice. The German experience with penicillin development provides sobering lessons about the relationship between political systems and scientific progress. The policies that drove talented scientists into exile, the allocation of resources away from pharmaceutical research toward immediate military priorities, and the breakdown of international scientific collaboration all contributed to Germany's inability to develop effective antibiotic production capability. These failures demonstrate that scientific achievement requires not only technical expertise, but also social and political environments that support innovation and international cooperation. Today, as the world faces new challenges from antibiotic-resistant bacteria, the lessons of wartime penicillin development remain highly relevant. The emergence of resistant strains threatens to return humanity to a pre-antibiotic era where common infections could once again become life-threatening. Addressing this challenge requires the same type of coordinated research effort, industrial commitment, and international cooperation that made penicillin mass production possible during the Second World War. The success of that earlier effort provides both inspiration and practical guidance for contemporary efforts to develop new antibiotics and preserve the effectiveness of existing ones. The humanitarian legacy of penicillin extends beyond its direct medical applications to its role in establishing principles of universal access to life-saving medical treatments. The transition from military monopoly to civilian availability demonstrated that medical advances developed during wartime could be adapted to serve broader human needs. The international technology transfer programs that brought penicillin production to countries around the world established precedents for sharing medical knowledge and capabilities that continue to influence global health policy today. For the millions of people whose lives were saved by penicillin treatment during and after the Second World War, the drug represented nothing less than a miracle. Soldiers who survived infections that would have been fatal in previous conflicts went on to live full lives, raise families, and contribute to the rebuilding of their societies. Civilians who received antibiotic treatment for conditions that had previously been death sentences were able to pursue careers, create art, advance science, and enrich human culture in countless ways. The cumulative impact of these saved lives on human civilization is immeasurable. The story of penicillin also demonstrates the importance of serendipity in scientific discovery, while simultaneously showing that chance observations only become transformative innovations when they are recognized, developed, and applied by dedicated researchers and supportive institutions. Fleming's contaminated petri dish might have been discarded and forgotten without his trained eye to recognize its significance. Florian Chain's systematic development of penicillin therapy might have remained a laboratory achievement without the industrial mobilization that made mass production possible. Every stage of the process required human insight, dedication, and collaboration to transform possibility into reality. As we face current global health challenges, from pandemic diseases to antibiotic resistance to health inequities between developed and developing nations, the example of wartime penicillin development offers both hope and practical guidance. It demonstrates that seemingly impossible problems can be solved when scientific knowledge, industrial capability, political will, and humanitarian commitment are aligned toward common goals. It shows that collaboration between academia, government, and industry can accelerate progress beyond what any single institution could achieve alone. Most importantly, it proves that investment in scientific research and medical development, even under the most challenging circumstances, can produce benefits that transform human civilization for generations to come. The miracle drug that German doctors never expected America to develop ultimately saved lives on both sides of the conflict and continues to protect human health around the world. The legacy of this achievement reminds us that science knows no national boundaries, that human ingenuity can overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges, and that the pursuit of healing represents one of humanity's highest aspirations. In an age when global cooperation seems increasingly difficult to achieve, the story of penicillin stands as proof that when lives are at stake, human beings can transcend their differences and work together to create miracles. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through the development of penicillin during World War II. If this documentary has inspired or educated you, please subscribe to our channel for more historical content, hit that like button, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know where in the world you're watching from. We love connecting with history enthusiasts from around the globe. Your support helps us continue producing these in-depth historical documentaries that bring the past to life.